Welcome to Module 6. In this module, we'll focus on several requirements that are important as a federal aid project moves closer to construction. We'll look at three main areas: right-of-way acquisition, federal procurement, and disadvantaged business enterprise requirements, and finally, compliance monitoring. Although these requirements address different parts of project delivery, they all contribute to the same goal of keeping the project compliant and eligible for federal funding. Let's start with right-of-way and what needs to happen before construction can move forward. Right-of-way, or ROW, acquisition is the process used to purchase land or gain easements or other property rights necessary to develop and construct a transportation project. Depending on the project, additional property or property rights such as construction easements may be necessary before shovels hit the ground. For federally funded projects, the process must be deliberate and legally secured. The right-of-way process is separate but linked to other project requirements such as procurement or environmental review, so it is an important part of the effort. I can't stress this enough for project managers. It is key to work with a team to recognize potential right-of-way needs early and incorporate them into the project delivery process. Best practice is to make sure you have a way to respond if right-of-way needs change, because this can be a lengthy process. All that being said, the right-of-way acquisition follows a process beginning with a preliminary right-of-way assessment. This initial step identifies whether the project will require property acquisition and what potential right-of-way impacts may need to be addressed. From there, the right-of-way team progresses toward establishing fair market value and negotiating with affected property owners. If households are affected, relocation activities occur later in the process. This is where there's a lot of protections for community, which is important for maintaining their trust. It is also important to understand the relationship between environmental review and right-of-way. Environmental clearance is a prerequisite to right-of-way acquisition, but it is not itself one of the right-of-way acquisition steps. The important takeaway here is that right-of-way activities need to happen in the appropriate sequence. So, why is completing the right-of-way process so important? Well, federal partners will check. And obviously, you don't want to explain to a property owner why your project is on their property. So before construction begins, the agency must demonstrate that the necessary property rights have been legally secured. It's why we'll continue to stress that right-of-way certification is a critical milestone before construction. If an agency begins construction before right-of-way acquisition is properly certified, the project may be out of compliance and federal funding could potentially be withheld or withdrawn. Right-of-way certification does not replace environmental review. Instead, it confirms that the project has the legal property rights necessary to move forward. For project managers, this means making sure right-of-way requirements are completed and documented before construction begins. This is yet another critical element that will make sure the project can stay on schedule. Next, let's shift from property requirements to federal procurement. Federal procurement requirements are designed to promote fair competition and compliance with federal standards. An important distinction is that the federal procurement is not simply about achieving the lowest possible project cost. The process itself needs to be fair, competitive, and compliant with applicable requirements. Competitive bidding remains an important part of the process, helping ensure that federally funded contracts are awarded through an appropriate and transparent procurement process. These requirements help establish a consistent framework for how federal aid project contracts are procured. Within federal procurement, another important consideration is the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise, or DBE program. The DOT DBE program was reauthorized by Congress in November 2021 in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, which set participation goals for certified DBE firms. Updates on these percentages may have changed and are influenced by local conditions. Ultimately, this means that contractors must address applicable participation goals using firms that meet the required DBE certification. It's also important to remember that DBE firms are not exempt from federal procurement standards. They follow applicable procurement requirements as other firms. So the goal is to support DBE participation within a fair and compliant procurement process. An important part of DB compliance is understanding what actually counts toward participation goals. For example, a subcontract awarded to a certified minority-owned small business can count toward DB participation when that business has the appropriate DBE certification. The key word here is certification. A vendor that does not have DBE certification would not count toward the participation goal. The prime contract may be awarded to the lowest bidder that meets the DBE requirements. Agencies need to verify DBE certification and properly track participation throughout the project delivery. Right-of-way and DBE requirements are part of the broader responsibility to maintain federal compliance throughout project delivery. Compliance monitoring helps ensure that the project meets applicable requirements and remains eligible for federal funding. It includes monitoring items such as required project progress reports, those right-of-way requirements we talked about earlier, DBE participation, and associated documentation. It's simply good practice on any project, but extra important on federal efforts. The important point is that compliance is not something that gets checked only once. It requires ongoing attention as the project progresses from one phase to the next. For project managers, maintaining accurate and current documentation is an important part of demonstrating that those requirements continue to be met. The consequences of noncompliance can be significant. For example, failure to submit required project progress reports can place federal funding at risk. So, before beginning construction, the necessary right-of-way has to be secured and certified. Failure to properly track DB participation can also create a compliance issue. These requirements demonstrate a consistent principle. Receiving federal funding comes with ongoing responsibilities. Failure to meet those responsibilities can jeopardize the project's continued eligibility for federal funds. That's why compliance needs to be actively monitored throughout the project delivery, rather than addressed only when the project is ready for construction. To wrap up, think about these requirements as connected pieces of federal aid project delivery. Right-of-way ensures that the necessary property rights are legally secured before construction begins. Federal procurement requirements promote fair competition and compliance with federal standards that helps meet our goals. DB requirements establish participation for appropriately certified firms. And finally, compliance monitoring helps ensure these and other requirements continue to be met throughout the project. For project managers, the overarching lesson is to identify these requirements early, monitor them throughout project delivery, and maintain the documentation necessary to demonstrate compliance. Doing so helps protect federal funding and prepares the project to successfully move forward into construction. That's it for this month. Mahalo.